Welcome back to another highly requested video. This time it's the timing belt replacement on the Hyundai Getz. Now you need to do this every 90,000 kilometers or every 6 years depending on which one comes first. Our model is the 2010 with the 1.4 litre G4EE engine in it, but this video will also be applicable to the 1.6 litre G4ED. These engines can be found in the Getz from 2006 to 2011, as well as a number of other Hyundai models and even other vehicles. So stay tuned and we'll show you how to get this installed. We'll quickly run through all the tools and parts you're going to need to do this job. So we've got genuine parts from Hyundai, so the timing belt, a tensioner assembly and spring, as well as the idler assembly. This pulley holding tool can be really handy for holding that crankshaft pulley. Grab yourself a crowbar, a hammer and a flathead screwdriver, as well as some gloves and some safety glasses, and then you'll need a jack and an axle stand. In terms of the sockets and spanners, you're going to need a metric set that can do 10, 12, 14, 21 and 22, and it can be really handy to have a few different sized extensions. The torque wrenches, you'll need ones that can do 7 foot-pounds to 105 foot-pounds or 9 newton meters to 142 newton meters, but you can forego this one if you don't have one that small. The larger one is the important one. So the timing belt on this car is actually on the side of the engine, so we're going to remove the front right wheel to get access to it. So I'm just going to crack these wheel nuts with a 21mm socket, and then I'm going to jack the car up. Remember to chock your wheels before you get started. So there's a jacking point just behind the front right wheel, just here. We're going to jack it up and then place the axle stand underneath the chassis rail. Then we can proceed to removing the 4 wheel nuts and take the wheel off. So looking under the front right side of the car, we need to remove this cover plate, which is held on by 4 10mm bolts. So grab your 10mm socket and you'll probably need a few extensions, and we're going to remove those. So put this cover over to the side because we're going to reinstall that later. That now gives you nice access to the side of the engine. So up in the engine bay now, and if your car has an engine cover, you're going to want to remove it. This one already had it removed. So we are going to remove the drive belts to get access to the timing belt behind here. But before we do that, we're going to loosen off these 4 bolts on the water pump pulley. And the reason we do that now is that belt tension is going to help stop that pulley from spinning and allow us to loosen those bolts easier. You'll find that there's not much room between the pulley and the car body, so we're going to use a 10mm ring spanner to loosen those off. I'm also just going to tap that spanner lightly with a hammer just to shock those bolts and help loosen them. So now that those water pump pulley bolts are loose, we can start removing the 3 drive belts. So while we're at the top here, we'll loosen the power steering belt, and the way you do that is by loosening 2 bolts, one in here and one on the side here, and they're both a 12mm. Again, we found that an open-ended spanner is the easiest to get in between these tight spaces. So once you've loosened those bolts, you should have enough play in the power steering pump to get that belt off, but we're first going to loosen and remove the other 2 belts. So to loosen the alternator belt, we'll need to loosen 3 bolts on the alternator, which is located directly beneath the power steering pump. Those 3 bolts that you need to loosen in order are this lock bolt here, this tensioning bolt, and then another bolt that we'll show you from underneath the car. So the alternator pivot bolt is located just here, directly above your oil filter, and it's a 12mm as well. Similar to the power steering pump, now that all those bolts are loose, we're able to rock the alternator to relieve the tension on the belt. Looking from inside the right hand wheel well now, and the last bolt we need to loosen is this one here, which takes a 12mm, and that's to loosen off your air conditioning belt. Now all the bolts are loose, we can start removing the 3 belts. We found that the power steering belt is easiest to remove from the top of the engine. It's a good idea to make note of which belt is which because we're going to put them back on later. Next up, we need to remove those 4 water pump pulley bolts that we loosened earlier and then remove that pulley. So again, you're going to need a 10mm spanner. This is one of those jobs where if you have a ratcheting spanner, they come in really handy. So put that over to the side because we'll install that later. So next up, we're going to remove the upper timing belt cover, and there's 4 bolts that take a 10mm socket. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Take note that this corner bolt down here does also hold this cable bracket, so we'll need to reinstall that later. Once those 4 bolts are loose, we should be able to just lift that top cover off. If your rubber gasket is loose like this one, you can just remove it and we'll reinstall it into the timing belt cover. For now, we'll put this cover and the gasket aside and we'll reinstall it later. Right, pause. At this point, we're going to be removing timing components in the engine. You want to make sure that you follow the factory service manual and the steps listed, otherwise you could seriously damage your engine. Looking from above the crankshaft pulley now, and what we need to do is align the marking on the crankshaft pulley with the T marking on the timing belt cover. We do this by turning the crankshaft pulley clockwise until those markings are aligned, and then we can proceed to the next step. To rotate this crankshaft pulley, you're going to need a 22mm socket on the crankshaft pulley bolt. So I'm coming up to that timing mark now. If you overshoot that marking, you'll need to do approximately 2 full turns of the crankshaft pulley to get it back to where it needs to be. Once we've aligned the timing markings on the crankshaft pulley below, we need to come to the top of the engine bay and check the camshaft sprocket, which is up here. The timing markings on the camshaft sprocket are this hole here, and there's another marking on the inside on the cylinder head cover behind this sprocket. If you find that these markings aren't aligned, but down below your crankshaft is, you need to rotate your crankshaft 1 full revolution. The reason for this is that the camshaft sprocket will turn once for every 2 rotations of the crankshaft. When these 2 markings are aligned on the crankshaft and the camshaft pulleys, your number 1 cylinder is at top dead center on the compression stroke. So this particular crankshaft pulley doesn't actually have any holes to hold the pulley while you try to loosen the bolt, but we found that you can use a tool inside these slotted areas to help hold the pulley. So we're going to do that now and loosen off the bolt. You're going to need a 22mm socket to loosen it. You'll notice that while you're doing that, you may end up turning the pulley slightly. So we're going to go up to the top and make sure that all the timing marks are still in the correct position. So once you've checked all the timing marks again, we can come back and remove this bolt. Now that it's quite loose, you can just hold the pulley to stop it from turning and loosen the bolt off. If you do have trouble getting this bolt loose, you can try soaking it in some penetrating fluid like WD-40. Then you can remove your crankshaft pulley, and you might need to get your screwdriver in behind and just help to wedge it off. So take note of the orientation as well, and then you can remove this little flange that sits behind the pulley. So that now gives us access to the crankshaft sprocket as well as the lower timing cover. Now this cover has 5 bolts, 3 of which are easily accessed from here, so we'll remove those now with a 10mm socket, and then we'll jump up the top and remove the other 2. So the last 2 bolts are this one here and this one here, again using a 10mm socket or spanner. Once those 5 bolts are removed, you should be able to remove the lower timing cover. So we'll pop that over to the side with the other one because we'll reinstall those later. You can replace the timing belt without replacing the tensioner and the idler pulley, which is further up, but given the parts are cheap and you've already gone through this effort, we would recommend replacing those when you do the timing belt. If you are going to reuse them though, check them for any signs of wear and tear or damage to the bearings as described in the factory service manual. So we're going to continue by removing this tensioner here, which is held on by 2 bolts. There's one here behind the timing belt and one just here, and it takes a 12mm socket. Hang on to these bolts and keep note of which one goes where, because we'll need to install those later. To get the belt off, I'm just going to push the tensioner away from the belt. And then I can slowly massage the belt off this bottom sprocket. Then I can relieve the tension in the tensioner. Hold that belt to the side, and now we can remove that second 12mm bolt. So we can remove that tensioner assembly, and you want to keep that bolt and that spacer because we're going to reinstall it. Now that the timing belt is loose, you want to be really careful not to rotate any of these sprockets. We're now able to remove the timing belt from the top camshaft sprocket. So now we're going to remove this idler pulley here, which takes a 14mm socket. And again, just remove that bolt. At this point, we can grab our new idler pulley and install that. So you want to put the bolt through the middle. Then we can grab our torque wrench and torque that bolt up to 35 foot-pounds or 47 Newton meters. Quick check to make sure that that pulley is spinning freely. And then we'll jump down and install the tensioner. So we bought a new spring to go with the new tensioner, and the way it's installed is you grab this bolt that had the bushing through it and pop that through the spring. Then we grab the tensioner, and we're going to put the spring on this side of this tab for now, just so that the spring's not under tension while we're trying to install it. We're putting the bottom side of the spring on that side of that little ridge and just getting the bolt started. Then we're going to push the top end of the spring onto that side of the ledge and hold it in position while we tighten this bolt up a bit more. So again, 12mm socket. That should now stay in position and we can put this other bolt in. So to do that, you just want to push the tensioner out of the way, and then you can put this bolt in finger tight. So before we put the timing belt on, we're going to recheck all the timing marks just to make sure that nothing has moved. And the first set that we're going to check is down here on the crankshaft sprocket. You can see that there's a little divot on the back of the sprocket here, and you need to line that up with this little tab. So just come up to the top and double check the camshaft sprocket again, and that's that hole there and that little mark on the inside. So we're ready to install the new timing belt now, and you'll notice that the new belt has these arrows on it to show direction. So we're going to install it in that direction on the car, and this engine goes clockwise, so it'll go in and on like that. So you want to start with the bottom crankshaft sprocket and then feed your way up to the idler pulley and around the top camshaft sprocket. Once you're happy that it's sitting all right up the top, we can go down the bottom and feed it around the tensioner. So at this point, we need to come back and loosen this bolt. Now keep in mind that the tensioner will want to come down towards the belt, so you'll need to apply a bit of pressure on the tensioner that way and slide the belt onto this side of this pulley. So now we want to check all the teeth on the sprockets and make sure that they're nicely aligned with the belt. And I can see that it is the case down here. So I'm just going to go up and check the camshaft. I'm happy with how this is all lined up. So I can go down the bottom now and start the tensioning procedure for the timing belt. So in terms of tensioning the actual belt, all you need to do is keep these two bolts loose for the time being. And that's going to allow the tensioner to pivot on this slotted hole. That spring rate of the spring is going to be what's giving that force onto your belt. Once you're happy with that, you basically just torque these two bolts down and and then we come back and check the actual belt to see that the tension is correct. So grab your torque wrench now with a 12mm socket. We're going to torque both of those bolts up to 17 foot-pounds or 23 Newton meters. At this point, the factory service manual says to recheck the tension, and the way that it describes is by applying a force horizontally on the side of the belt here towards the tensioner. Now it says about 5 kilos or about 50 newtons, and that needs to deflect the belt a certain distance that's described in the manual, and we'll show that on screen. Given this is all new, we're pretty comfortable that this is the correct tension, and we're going to continue on to the next steps. So the next step is going to be to verify the timing, and the way we're going to do that is by installing the crankshaft bolt and turning the crankshaft 2 revolutions, and then rechecking the timing marks on both the crankshaft sprocket and the camshaft sprocket up the top. So grab a 22mm socket, and we need to turn the crankshaft in the operating direction, which is clockwise. So once we get near the top of the second revolution on the crankshaft pulley, we're going to intentionally line that mark up with the correct timing mark on the back, and then we're going to check the camshaft at the top to make sure that the timing is correct. So with the bottom marks all aligned, I can see that the top marks are also aligned, which means that my timing is all good. And now we can just remove that crankshaft bolt, and then install the bottom timing cover, and we'll do the 3 bottom bolts from the bottom and the 2 tops from the top. So the correct torque setting for these bolts is 7 foot-pounds or 9 Newton meters. So if you do have a small torque wrench like this one, you can use that. But otherwise, just snug them down. Just don't go too hard. Then we can move up the top and install the other 2 bolts. So these 2 top ones have the same torque spec of 7 foot-pounds and 9 Newton meters. Then we can reinstall our crankshaft pulley. So put that little backing plate first, and you want the cup side facing away. When you put these in, you'll notice that there's a key on the shaft, and you want to line up these pieces with that key. Then finally, you can put your bolt in. Now we can torque up that crankshaft bolt, and the correct setting is 105 foot-pounds or 142 Newton meters. That takes the 22mm socket with a torque wrench, and again you're going to need something to hold the pulley. For the top cover, just remember that it had that rubber gasket in there as well, so if yours came out like ours did, just push that back in. This one has 4 bolts. Remember that the lower left one had the little bracket for the cable, so you want to reinstall that when you put this bolt in. So the correct torque spec for these is 7 foot-pounds or 9 Newton meters using a 10mm socket. If you do have a torque wrench, you can use that, otherwise just snug them down. So the water pump pulley has these 2 parts, the smaller one and the larger one. The smaller one just sits inside the larger like that, and the cupped faces sit towards the engine bay. So once those 4 bolts are back on, we can put the belts back on, and they'll hold the pulley while we torque them up. So I'll start with the power steering belt. Next I'll grab my AC belt, and that one goes around the inside of the crankshaft, and then the AC compressor up the top, and then the flat side goes on the back of this pulley here. If you find that the belt's hard to get on, try backing off the tensioner here. Once you put that belt on, it is a ribbed belt, so just check that all the ribs are running in the correct slots on the pulleys. Last up, we'll do the alternator belt. So that one goes around the water pump pulley that we installed before, the alternator and the crankshaft. Again, if you're struggling to get that belt on, just loosen this tensioning bolt here. You can even lift this up out of the slot to give the alternator plenty of room to move and that belt plenty of slack. And same as before, it is a ribbed belt, so you want to just check and make sure that the ribs are all running correctly in the pulleys. So now that all the belts are on, I'm going to start tensioning. Now we do have a full video on how to do this and we'll link that in the description below, but I'm just going to go over it briefly here. To do the AC belt, all you need to do is tighten this 12mm bolt here. Once you're happy with the tension on this belt, we'll move on to the alternator belt from above. So remembering for the alternator, we have the adjustment bolt here and the locking bolt here, and then the pivot bolt underneath. We're going to start by tightening with this one, and we're going to lock it off, then we're going to jump underneath and lock that pivot bolt. Then I've just checked the tension and I'm happy with that, so I'll lock it off with the lock bolt. So that pivot bolt is the one that's located just above the oil filter, so we're just going to snug that one down as well. So the last one to tension is the power steering belt up here, and you'll need something like a crowbar or a pry bar just to bring that power steering pump away and tension the belt while you lock off the bolt here. So you don't need too much force, just lightly apply a bit of pressure to bring the pump away, and then tighten this bolt with a 12mm spanner. Once you're happy with that tension, you can tighten this lock bolt down here, again with a 12mm. So once you've checked your belt tensions and you're happy with those, we're going to jump down and torque up those 4 bolts on the water pump pulley. Now, they do have a specified torque of 7 foot-pounds or 9 Newton-meters. However, we found that even with our small little torque wrench, we couldn't fit it down there. So I'm just going to snug those bolts up with a 10mm spanner. Once that's done, we can jump underneath and install that lower right hand cover. So again, that one takes the 4 10mm bolts. You don't need to do them up super tight, just snug them down. So now we're ready to put the front right wheel back on. We're just going to put these nuts on loosely for now, and then we'll tighten it properly once it's back on the ground. So now we can start removing the jack. So we'll need to go up a little bit just to get that jack stand out. And then we can lower the car to the ground. So you want to use a 21mm socket and do these to 70 foot-pounds or 95 Newton-meters. So the last thing you want to do is grab the sticker that came with the timing belt, and you can mark that with the kilometers that the car's done as well as the date, and then we're going to stick that in the engine bay somewhere away from where the heat and stuff is so the sticker will last. At this point, you can put your engine cover back on if you've got one. So that sums up the timing belt change on the Hyundai Getz. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our other videos on this car. If there's any feedback you've got for us, let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.